Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
About some of the issues that are going on in our society, and look at a couple of the booklets that we've made available here on Point of View. I think you're going to find this very helpful. And so this hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the booklet we have on a biblical view of the liberal mind, and then also one on a biblical view of the deep state. Now, that might strike you as two very different topics, but they're bound together by a couple of things that I thought we might talk about before we get into the booklets. The first is they're bound together by a man by the name of Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is a Swiss-born, Vienna-born, I guess I should say, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Many years ago, almost 7 decades ago, he wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom. What you're going to find as we go through this, these connect up very quickly to some of the things that he warned England about after World War II, and it helps us understand not only the liberal mind, but also kind of the idea of a bureaucracy. So, in some respects, even though these seem like very different topics that we'll talk about this hour, in some respects, what we are dealing with are topics that all go back to this kind of seminal book that was very well received back then, and even better received, I think about 10 years ago. It actually, once again, went on the bestseller list as an economy book. I think in large part because Glenn Beck and a number of other people were quoting from it. But nevertheless, we're going to see the connection there. The other connection between these two booklets is that these were actually topics that were recommended. The biblical view on the liberal mind was actually a book idea that was recommended by a producer of another radio program that I work with on other programs. And he was saying, you know, you really need to put together something that helps people understand kind of the liberal mindset. And even though we had done some interviews on it, it took me quite a while to figure out that really, without going into all these books, some of which go into all sorts of detail and a person's psychology and everything, these booklets have to be actually something you can read in about 10 minutes or less. So I began to realize, wait a minute, I know enough about this already to explain that. And so we will certainly learn from some of the material I've posted there. And some of it comes from Friedrich Hayek. A fair amount of it comes from, of course, the Bible and our understanding of human nature. And then the second booklet that we're going to look at later, A Biblical View of the Deep State, was actually recommended by one of the station managers that carries Point of View. And he just simply had asked a question about, had I ever written anything on this subject? And I sort of said, well, no, but I think I will. And so in some respects, these were also governed by some of the questions that people were asking at the time. And I thought that that would be very helpful. Let me just mention that as we talk about this today, either or both of these books are available through Point of View. So I'm hoping that you will take the time maybe to go to our website and contact us and let us know that you're interested in that, or send a note to, of course, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, and we'd be glad to send them off to you if you don't already receive them. By the way, one of the benefits of supporting Point of View is you receive these booklets in the mail, and I think you're going to find that they are an attempt to help you deal with many of these issues. I've had more than a few people tell me They appreciate this because what you're basically doing is saying, look, I know you're not going to read an entire book on, as we might talk about later, capitalism or socialism or climate change or immigration, but I'm willing to sit down for about 10 minutes and read something that is your summary of this material. And then at the very end, I oftentimes have some endnotes and always some additional resources that I think you're going to find very helpful. So let's get into this idea of the liberal mind. And the first thing I want to do is make a distinction that we've talked about here on Point of View. The distinction is between the left and liberalism. You have heard us say this before. Dennis Prager does a very good job of talking about that, because it used to be that we used the term the left or left wing and liberalism interchangeably. But he actually, on his PragerU videos, and I've got a footnote to it in case you'd like to watch those, makes a distinction. But let me just very quickly talk about a couple of key distinctions. Liberals and leftists have a different view of race, he says. For example, the traditional liberal position on race is that a color of a person's skin is insignificant. By contrast, the left and leftists argue that the notion of race itself is possibly important, and saying that race is insignificant, they would say, is a racist statement. For example, liberals are very committed to this idea of racial integration and would have rejected what is now becoming more and more popular on some campuses of separate black dormitories, separate black graduations, and all of the rest. So there's one example. Nationalism is another one. Dennis Prager says that liberals have always believed in the nation state. One of the profound arguments being made by probably one of the icons of liberalism was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that this battle that we fight against the Nazis is a battle for the nation, a battle for God, and battle for truth. And so that was certainly kind of the liberal idea. Leftists, on the other hand, oftentimes oppose this idea of nationalism and instead want to talk about such issues as class solidarity, and racial issues, again, is a very important one. Perhaps the best example, though, is the difference in free speech. American liberals agree with the statement, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. That is so typical of the ideas going all the way back to Voltaire and the French Enlightenment, and even just the whole idea of the English Enlightenment and David Hume and all the rest, all the way up to modern times as well. And you know that many times on this program, we will have various liberals on the program who, although they would probably disagree with us on a lot of issues, when it comes to the issue of free speech or a variety of others, we will be glad to have them on, because they believe that even if we may disagree, they certainly support our right to express those viewpoints. Is that the view of what you find on college campuses today? No, of course not. Leftists today are leading kind of a nationwide suppression of free speech, first of all on college campuses, but then even more significantly, that has moved from college campuses into the big tech companies. And one of the booklets I recommend that you go back and look at is a book called Campus Unrest. And that is certainly one, and also one on a biblical view on politicized culture. And a lot of that comes from a book that we did an interview with a liberal, Jonathan Haidt, on the coddling of the American mind. So you can see that there is a real distinction between the left and liberalism. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about, how does the issue of ethics relate to the liberal mind? What about this idea of human nature and the liberal mind, and even government and the liberal mind, and tolerance and the liberal mind, as a way to begin to understand individuals that may oppose a lot of things we talk about here on Point of View? But our goal is to try to help us understand more of why they think the way they think, and to also, from a biblical point of view, say that it is based upon a flawed, I think, view of human nature. But we need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation about a biblical view of the liberal mind right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last 2 decades, Christian Smith has helped us understand what is in the heads and hearts of young people. He is the co-author of such books as Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, and Lost in Transition. In his books, he coined the now famous term moralistic therapeutic deism. The term came up in a discussion on my radio program with Kara Powell about her book, Growing Young. She and her co-authors have identified a number of strategies that will attract young people to your church. The term moralistic therapeutic deism came up in the discussion because it is a good way to identify the beliefs of so many youths and young adults. It includes 5 key points. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5th and finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Well, as you can see, this viewpoint is not exactly Orthodox Christianity, and it certainly does not encompass the gospel. Instead, young people want to be moral and also believe in a God who is removed from their daily lives. An important question is whether this moralistic therapeutic deism viewpoint in the heads of young people because of bad theological teaching or poor listening. The authors of Growing Young argue that it is probably both. Sometimes pastors have not taught good theology, but we also must admit that most young people today are captive to the culture. That is why we must work harder to teach a biblical worldview to adults and youth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, focusing on this kind of a biblical view of the liberal mind, and you can find a lot of that in this booklet. As a matter of fact, I know some of you tend to take notes when you're listening to this program, and you certainly can do so, but the material that I'm covering pretty much is in these booklets, so if you want to get a copy, that is a way that you will have all the record of what we're talking about. And I want to focus some time and attention right now on ethics and the liberal mind, because I point out that the philosophical foundation for most liberal perspectives is secularism. Now, I recognize that there are liberals who have a Christian conviction, but if you're talking about where did this idea of classical liberalism come from, well, it came from the Enlightenment, came from humanistic ideas. And so if you start with the idea that you don't believe in God and you don't believe in the Bible, then you obviously don't believe in biblical absolutes, and you certainly don't believe in moral absolutes. As Dostoevsky said, if God is dead, then everything is permitted. And so you've got to recognize that, of course, even as I point out here, even atheists admit a view of God affects human nature. Richard Dawkins, of the so-called New Atheists, said recently that he was concerned that by removing religion from this society would be bad for society because it would give people, he says, a license to do really bad things. He talks about the idea of God as kind of like surveillance, or what he calls the divine spy camera in the sky. People generally tend to do right when someone is watching them. They tend to do bad things when nobody is watching. And so he goes on to add that the great spy camera theory isn't a good reason for him to believe in God, but he recognizes that there would be a danger in a world where you didn't believe in God and didn't believe in religion. And I think it's worth mentioning when we talk about ethics that a lot of the decisions being made, especially today by young people about right and wrong, really aren't based on logic. They're instead based on feelings. You know, I began to notice this decades ago when I was speaking on campus. College students began to make statements originally by saying, well, I think, as they started their statements. Then I started to see more and more of them say, I feel. And so it was really, in a sense, no longer was reason necessarily important to the discussion. It was how they felt about it. Emotion was more important. And so in some respects, that is the case. And I also point out in this little booklet that the liberal mind has a very different foundation for discussing right and wrong. I may quote back to Dennis Prager, who I've mentioned before, because he admitted that he had been wrong. He said all of his life, he said that the left's moral compass is broken. He now concluded that in order to have a broken moral compass, you need to have a moral compass to begin with, and the left doesn't have one. Now, he doesn't mean that as an attack. It's merely what he says is an observation. The left really doesn't think in terms of of good and evil. We assume that other people oftentimes think the way we do, but that's not always the case. And so we have to recognize that oftentimes even the categories of good and evil we think about aren't necessarily shared by other people in society. How do we think about that from a biblical point of view? I think it's pretty obvious. A biblical view of ethics and morality begins, first of all, with the reality that God exists, that he has revealed to us moral principles that we're to apply, and these absolute moral principles are tied to God's character, thus unchanging. And so right off the bat, you see a difference between liberalism and a biblical worldview. Let's move to the next point. Human nature and the liberal mind. Leftists and even some liberals have, if I might say, a more naive, maybe even an accurate view of human nature. And I think you can really discover this for yourself by asking people if they believe that others are basically good. Are people in society basically good? You almost always get an affirmative answer that most people will say, yeah, we live in a civilized society. And so most people say, yeah, I think people are basically good. And we sort of get away with that in our world because we don't have to deal with a level of corruption and terror that strikes so many people in other parts of the society. But then if you press the question, I think you'll see how liberals have a difficulty explaining things like, well, the Holocaust, Muslim terrorism, because in most people, and especially the liberal mind, there's an assumption that people are basically good. And after all, that's what secular psychologists have been saying and philosophers for some time. And even after 2 world wars and all of the things that we can talk about that illustrate the evil nature of human nature, there's still kind of a tendency for people to believe that they are basically good. Now, from a biblical point of view, we can, of course, reject that idea as well, because the Bible teaches, for example, in Romans 3:23, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And so this idea of deceitfulness, maybe in some respects, seems really extreme until I realize even in Matthew 15, Jesus talks about that out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. But if nothing else, I think this kind of, if you will, naive view of human nature explains kind of something else in terms of the liberal mind. And we talked about that when we did the interview on the coddling of the American mind, because one of their beliefs is in the battle for truth of us versus them, it's the idea that people are basically good. And so if someone disagrees with you, they must be a bad person. In other words, if they disagree with you, it's not just that they are wrong, but they are evil. And so you can begin to see why there is such tribalism and polarization as we are moving more and more into a secular society. Now, I'd say again, the Bible teaches very quickly that we're all created in God's image, that we have value, we have dignity, we have nobility, but we also have a sin nature. And so in some respects, we should disagree with people with humility and with grace. And that's certainly what the Bible might teach. Then what about the view of government? Well, that comes immediately from this view of human nature. Why do liberals and the left promote big government? And I said, well, the simple answer is they relates to their view of human nature. If you believe that people are basically good, then it's easy to assume that political leaders and bureaucrats will want to do the very best for their citizens. We agree that government is important. We see that in Romans 13, 1-7, and we see there's a role for government. But as I point out, Friedrich Hayek, when he wrote the book, The Road to Serfdom, was simply pointing out that sometimes the road to serfdom can be paved with good intentions. Most government officials and bureaucrats write laws and rules and regulations with every good intention. They desire to make the world a better place for preventing catastrophe and by encouraging positive actions from their citizens. But in their desire to control and direct everything, they can very easily lead us down the road to serfdom. And then finally, what about tolerance and the liberal mind? The idea of liberalism sounds pretty open-minded. After all, this idea that you have your view and I have my view. But that has changed. While liberalism certainly championed the idea of free thought and free speech, as we've pointed out now, the leftists have once again kind of taken that over and instead have said, well, in this politically correct culture, they began to move the lines and say that we really should have zero tolerance for anybody that strays from what we consider to be orthodoxy. And so the politically correct culture leads to the cancel culture. And in some respects, the desire to smear an individual if we disagree with them, to try to get them to lose their job, to dox them, and all of the rest. And one of the phenomena that promotes intolerance has been this idea of smears and negative labels. And so all sorts of things have been redefined. Patriotism is now xenophobia. Believing that there are differences between males and females is sexist. Promoting the idea that there is one race is called racist. Even trying to question some of the views that are being proposed about marriage is homophobic. And so those kinds of smears are actually being used. Again, how do we Christians think about this? Well, we recognize that this word tolerance has been redefined, which is why I spend so much time in the last section of this book talking about what a biblical view of tolerance would be, and most importantly, try to use the word civility. Because a civil person acknowledges that he or she does not possess all wisdom and knowledge, but instead recognizes, really in its the sense, the golden rule. I would want to treat other people as I would want to be treated. And if nothing else, Philippians 2:3 says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, let each of us regard one another as more important than himself. So if nothing else, I wanted you to understand that if you want to develop a biblical view of the liberal mind, there are striking differences between what has been part of classical liberalism and what would be a biblical worldview. And I've skipped over some sections, so if you'd like to read the booklet, well, it's available through Point of View. We're going to take a break, and we're going to move to the next topic, and that is a biblical view of the deep state. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to look at another booklet that we have been talking about. The first one, of course, is the idea of the liberal mind. The second one is the biblical view of the deep state. And both of these are sort of tied together, as I mentioned at the outset, by the writings by Friedrich Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. This Vienna-born Nobel Prize-winning economist talked about a couple of things. First of all, how when you become dependent on a bureaucracy, how that really changes the character of people. That's a very significant part of his book, The Road to Serfdom. And you think about this, if you become dependent more and more on the welfare state, then you, of course, aren't necessarily thinking about independence. If you are so dependent on entitlements, you begin to think you're entitled. So you can see how that affects you. The second part of that is what we're going to talk about as well, and that is bureaucrats oftentimes come into the bureaucracy because they want to write laws, rules, regulations. They want to, in some respects, control what is taking place. And I don't necessarily always want to be critical of bureaucracies and bureaucrats, but there is, if you will, sort of an iron law of bureaucracies that we need to pay attention to. And so when I put together this one on the deep state, I did so because some people are saying, well, how do I sort this out? And I start the booklet by even pointing out that if you go to Wikipedia, it oftentimes refers to the deep state, and other articles oftentimes refer to the deep state as a conspiracy theory. And it really depends on how you define that. If you mean that there's a dangerous group of people within the federal bureaucracy trying to fulfill some kind of fears by a QAnon conspiracies, okay, that doesn't fit. But if you're talking about lifelong bureaucrats, oftentimes buried deep in the federal bureaucracy, who aren't accountable oftentimes to the American people, and because of that, tend to be more interested in their survival and the department's survival, then I think the label is correct. So in some is incorrect, I should say, and it's correct to talk about the deep state. Because if you think about this, even 40 years ago when I was studying government in graduate school, there were political scientists at that time that were talking about how the bureaucracy had become kind of the fourth branch of government, which is kind of interesting because, of course, the bureaucracy is supposed to be part of the executive branch, but it almost operates independently from the president. They were talking about, in some respects, this idea of an iron triangle between congressional committees, the bureaucracy, and interest groups working together. And at the time, kind of the major challenge facing at that time, which was incoming President Reagan, was this issue. Well, if that was something they were talking about in the 1980s, let's face it, the bureaucracy is a lot larger. It's bigger, and it's even perhaps less interested than ever in working with the incoming president. Because after all, I mean, if you are working in the federal bureaucracy, you recognize that the president coming into office will be gone in 4 years or 8 years, depending how long. You will still be working long after that administration's nothing more than a mention in the history books. So that's kind of the idea I want to express. If you're thinking about some deep conspiratorial kind of thing, well, that's not the issue. The issue is there is a deep state that has been defined. And so let me try to define it a little bit first, and then we'll get into some of the aspects. The actual phrase deep state comes from kind of a phrase in Turkey, of all things, in which you had one author called it kind of shadow or parallel system of government in which officials or publicly unacknowledged individuals play important roles in defining and implementing state policy. Now, in Turkey, where this was a phrase that was first developed, it was oftentimes identifying what would be called unacknowledged persons who were in fact agents of various criminal organizations. Well, you don't have to look to Turkey to get an idea of that. Let's just look to Mexico for just a minute. Because if you think about this right now, the drug cartels in Mexico, not officially part of the government, but you can still see the idea being explained there. They have, in many cases, made very significant inroads into the government. They have control of various levels of the government, and it's difficult for whatever president you have in Mexico or other elected officials to defeat them. Now, that may be a more extreme example of that, but it helps you understand kind of the range of what some people have been talking about in terms of the deep state. Now, it is interesting that politicians and even some pundits who use the term deep state to describe the government bureaucracies in this country don't necessarily mean it in that extreme way. I got that. They merely mean that there seems to be kind of a parallel system of government that appears to operate sometimes outside of official channels. These bureaucrats have done quite a bit to frustrate incoming presidents. As a matter of fact, I thought it was interesting that when former President Donald Trump came into office, he used the term deep state more than previous presidents, so that's where it had kind of a common currency. And that led to a question from the White House press corps for White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, and he observed that after 8 years of one party in office, that would be the Obama administration, he said there are people who stay in government who actually continue to espouse the agenda of the previous administration and have actually burrowed into government. Now, what I found so interesting, I've got this with a smile on my face, is that if you looked at many of these articles written a few years ago, which at that time were very quickly dismissing President Trump's tweets about a deep state. But just before incoming President Joe Biden came into office, I found an article in Politico written just about the day before the inauguration of Joe Biden, in which it was warning of a deep state of Trump loyalists who might be trying to undermine the Biden administration. And then the article points to a number of Trump administration political appointees that were now burrowing into career positions throughout the federal government. And so in the booklet, I say, apparently the idea of deep state was more of a conspiracy theory when Trump was in office, but now suddenly deep state was a real threat to the Biden administration. And I think it gives you an idea that depending on who's in office and who is concerned about whether the bureaucracy is responsive to the president depends on whether or not you hear the phrase deep state. But what about the history of the deep state? I think it's fair to point out that this is not a new phenomenon. I'm old enough to remember back in the 1950s when, after he was leaving office, President Dwight Eisenhower warned about what he called the military-industrial complex. He did that in a televised farewell address. And his speech was especially significant because, after all, this is the man who had previously served the nation as a military commander in the Allied forces during World War II. But he was still concerned that there was in place a permanent armaments industry. They were concerned, and he was concerned, about the alliance between the arm industry and the military establishment. That's why he called on Americans to monitor what he called the military-industrial complex. So really, long before Donald Trump ever took office, some commentators were talking about a deep state. Liberals were concerned that after the 9/11 attacks, there was sort of a shadow government that was developing an intelligence community and Defense Department. And some of these rather opaque sections of the federal government were often unaccountable to our legal system. That led to Edward Snowden, if you know who he is, a National Security Agency contractor who began to leak information about what he felt was a dangerous reach of the government surveillance programs. In one interview, he proclaimed, there is definitely a deep state. And then he said, trust me, I've been there. And then you had a couple of books coming out. One was entitled The National Security and the Double Government. Another one called The Deep State, The Fall of the Constitution, The Rise of Shadow Government. And I go into some detail in which I point out that you have two governments. You have the visible government that Mike Lofton, former congressional aide, talked about, which is situated around the mall in Washington, D.C. Then there's another, he says, more shadowy, more indefinable government that's not exactly explained in Civics 101 or observable to tourists at the White House or the Capitol. He says he explained it wasn't a secret conspiratorial cabal, but rather the state within a state that is hiding mostly in plain sight. So this was a concern that even the liberals were bringing out of first under George Bush in the fight on war and terror, and then what continued under Barack Obama in terms of a deep state of individuals that had access to the levels of power and were able to do some things in the bureaucracy. And for many years, we've pointed out the fact that even though the executive branch supposedly is controlled by the president, because they're under civil service and really cannot be fired, oftentimes they can slow walk an initiative, they can decide to push ahead a different initiative, and you can begin to understand some of the impact of the deep state. Well, let's take a break. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which it functions. And then how do we think about it from a biblical point of view? We'll talk about that right after this.
It's well known that Planned Parenthood is the nation's largest abortion provider, supplying over half of all reported U.S. abortions. But the organization's annual report shows that it's also the second largest provider of hormone therapy to individuals who identify as transgender or who have gender dysphoria. Although this is called gender-affirming hormone therapy, there's no effort to affirm anyone's biological gender. This therapy involves providing physically healthy teenagers with hormones designed to interfere with the natural progression of puberty. Teens seeking gender transition are given cross-sex hormones to develop the secondary sex characteristics of the gender they identify with. So boys start to grow breasts, girls begin to get facial hair and lower voices. Mary Zook, director of the Center for Human Dignity at Family Research Council, points out that these medications can have lifelong health consequences, including interference with brain development, inhibition of normal bone density development, and sterilization. Yet teenage girls are arriving at clinics, often in groups, seeking and receiving these drugs. Journalist Abigail Schreier is the author of Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Her interview with a former Planned Parenthood employee revealed how shockingly easy it is for teens to get cross-sex hormone therapy at certain Planned Parenthood clinics. This former clinic worker told Ms. Schreier 1 to 2 new biologically female teen patients would arrive seeking testosterone per day. There were no doctors at this particular clinic. A gender counselor would ask a few questions, and an off-site mental health professional who would never actually see or speak with the patient would sign off. The clinic employee told Abigail Schreier that unlike abortion-minded women, trans-identifying kids are cash cows, and they are kept on the hook for the foreseeable future in terms of follow-up appointments, blood work, meetings, etc. No surprise here, Planned Parenthood is following the money. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Here for a few more minutes as we talk about a biblical view of the deep state. And let's talk about the nature of the bureaucracy and then give a biblical perspective on that. First of all, why do we have a bureaucracy? Well, the reason is that we can, in government, benefit from the research and experience of public servants who have devoted, in many cases, their lives to understanding the social or political implications of federal policies. This has always been necessary necessary, but perhaps even more crucial given the last presidents we've had. I mean, after all, Barack Obama became president after serving a half a term in the U.S. Senate. Donald Trump never served in government. And so those two presidents brought less experience with government than, say, for example, George Herbert Walker Bush, who served 8 years as vice president, along with serving as the UN ambassador, the liaison to China, CIA director. So in some respects, these experts in the bureaucracy can provide some context and really prevent presidents from, maybe the cabinets as well, from making mistakes that are going to result because they don't have that level of expertise. So that's the positive. The other side of that is that we may suppose that bureaucrats are there to implement the policies of the president and the administration. But, and again, the political appointees to the cabinet probably are more so. They oftentimes say that they serve at the pleasure of the president. And so while that is true, as you move down to the career civil servants, they may have a very different perspective, and sometimes to expect them to be involved, let's recognize they know they're going to be in government most likely longer than the 4 or 8 years a president holds office. They may think of the bureaucracy in some respects kind of like a military unit where everybody obeys every order. But that's not the bureaucracy that I know of or that you have ever seen. Bureaucracy isn't so much like a military unit. I'd say a bureaucracy is more like a university faculty, where you're part of a team, but you also have your own ideas about what needs to take place. And often the federal bureaucracy will slow down the implementation of a president's policies, or even sometimes just chooses to ignore the policies. And we have seen this both with Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. Tend to be more often where it happens to Republican presidents, because after all, many people in the bureaucracy tend to be more leaning to the left, tend to be more likely to be Democratic, but not necessarily the case. And this brings us back to the previous booklet we talked about, because in that booklet and The Liberal Mind, we talked about the idea that the road to serfdom can sometimes be paved with good intentions. Friedrich Hayek talked about this because he was concerned that most government officials and bureaucrats write laws and rules and regulations with good intention, but their ultimate desire is to make the world a better place. Let's give them credit where credit is due. But they also seek to control more and more aspects of our lives, and this can certainly be concerning when you have an entrenched bureaucrat that believes he or she knows best and chooses to ignore directives from the White House and even undermine the actions of the president. And so that's really what I am trying to talk about here in this idea of the deep state. Well, let's now, if we can, for the few minutes we have left, talk about a biblical perspective. First of all, as Christians, I think we should assume that someone in the bureaucracy would be a servant leader, and we should assume that bureaucrats would want to serve the public and provide services through the government. And I do know individuals that actually want to advance the government and do not have any kind of negative attitudes towards the incoming administration and want to serve effectively. And while there are millions of those dedicated civil service workers, there are also people who, because we believe in human sin nature, are selfish, merely looking out for themselves. And it's also true, I think it's fair to say, that one of the most important functions for someone working in a government bureaucracy is make sure that bureaucracy will continue. You rarely ever see a government bureaucracy actually going out of existence. They always find something else to focus their time and attention on. So their survival in the political world oftentimes can become more important than meeting the needs of the American people. This is one reason why those in the bureaucracy might turn against a president or even a member of Congress if they're trying to reform the system, because it might affect their jobs. And this is true, certainly, if they have a different political agenda and are in many cases trying to undermine what the president is trying to do. So again, as Christians, I don't think we should be surprised by that. We begin with the assumption that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We also recognize that people have nobility, rationality, altruism, because they're created in God's image. So we have both noble traits and sinful traits, and that should not surprise any of us. But even the best of government servants will not necessarily always be wise, not always be compassionate, not always be altruistic. And that's one of the reasons why the founders of this country established this idea of checks and balances in government to limit the impact of sinful behavior. The difficulty, though, arises in the fact that the federal bureaucracy has become much more important, much more influential than the other branches of government. And the other part of that is, so often Congress has been willing to let unelected bureaucrats make more and more decisions that affect our lives. We've seen this with so many pieces of legislation we've talked about here on Point of View. Occasionally, I've even read some quotes from these bills, which so often, for example, on the Affordable Care Act said, as the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. The members of Congress didn't determine it. They just simply said, we're going to let the secretary deal with that issue. We're going to let the bureaucracy deal with that issue, and we won't have an ongoing and important debate about what can take place. We'll simply cede all of that responsibility and all that power to unelected bureaucrats. After all, they don't have to stand for election, so they can make up all sorts of decisions, and in many cases, they can take the fire so that we don't have to. So if nothing else, I think we come to a conclusion by certainly recognizing that as Christians, we should support our government because it is one of the institutions ordained by God in Romans 13, 1-7. But we also, I think, should be calling for transparency and accountability from a bureaucracy that is oftentimes unaccountable to the citizens of this country. So again, if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this particular topic, it is one of the booklets that we have, and it's called A Biblical View on the Deep State. And of course, we earlier talked about a biblical view on the liberal mind. I wanted to put the two together because in some respects, they all go back to some of the very wise and insightful thoughts and comments from Friedrich Hayek in his book, The Road to Serfdom. And if nothing else, I think it's important for us as Christians to really think about how we should interact with other individuals that may have a different worldview and how to interact with a bureaucracy that sometimes is unaccountable. Just before we take a break, though, let me also mention that if you would like more information, of course, you can visit us at the website pointofview.net. If you'd like either one of the booklets, feel free to send us an email. We've made it very easy for you to do that. My Viewpoints commentary is there for you today to read, and there's a place for you to sign up to receive it in your inbox Monday through Friday. Benedexter's arrives on Saturday. And then we also have a take action item for you and encourage you to do the same. All of it available at the website pointofview.net. And I might also mention that these booklets, interestingly enough, are made available to those of you that give at a significant rate. And so if you have not supported Point of View and would like to receive these booklets on a monthly basis, all you have to do is click on that button that says Donate Now. You'll see how, in many ways, you can not only support this ministry, but benefit from these booklets we put in the mail to you once a month. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is a Friday weekend edition, and we are so excited that you can join with us. Over the next 2 hours, going to cover lots of different issues, and you know, so often during their weekend edition, we have a roundtable. Well, it turns out that everybody's schedule is such that they're not with me today, and I guess nobody loves me. But anyway, we're going to be here with you, and this will be a lot of fun, because one of the things that people love about the roundtable is we do cover a lot of the issues and oftentimes get different perspectives. The downside is sometimes people say, I never really want to call in because I don't want to interrupt anything that Kelly Shackelford, Dr. Merrill Matthews, Penna Dexter, whoever it might be, is on the program. So that gives you an opportunity today, maybe a little bit more unusual than typical on our weekend edition, where you can call in with some of your comments. And I'm going to talk about a number of different issues that are being debated right now in front of Congress. One of those is H.R. 1, which, again, if you have not taken the time, we have an action item for you to contact your U.S. Senate. But there's a very good piece. It's the first article I've posted by Kaylee McGee White. She's actually a graduate of Hillsdale College and has some great comments about how this piece of legislation is really being used to try to rig the game for Democrats in future elections. So I want to talk about that for just a minute. While that is being debated in the future in the Senate, what's being debated right now is a $1.9 trillion spending bill, which has taken a while to get to because Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, I love the Johnson from Wisconsin rhyme, nothing else, required the Senate to read all 500 plus pages, which may be one of the first times members of Congress, if they sat there, actually would find out what was in the bill. I hate to tell you, but they don't read the bills, and so it's going to be kind of interesting. But eventually they're going to vote on this, which gets me to my second article, which I've entitled America's Bankruptcy. This is a piece that really is trying to understand, if nothing else, why we don't at least talk about the financial implications of some of these trillion-dollar bills. And Neil Patel is the one that wrote this from the Daily Caller, so we'll get into that, and I'd love to get your thoughts about when we keep talking about spending vast amounts of money, and which a relatively small percentage of this money being spent is actually going to help those people that have been devastated by the pandemic and lockdown, and so much of the rest of it are little ornaments put on the Christmas tree. Since this is seen as a must-pass piece of legislation, everybody that knows that if you had an up or down vote on some of these particular aspects of this bill, or even some of the amendments that may or may not be added to it, they would go down to defeat, but they add them in there as well. Then I'll get into a couple of other issues. There are pollsters, surveys, others that are being done right now, many times in the Democratic Party. And I'm going to quote from some of these Democratic pollsters who are saying, you know what is happening? Democrats have worked their way out of even being able to depend on the minority vote because of what's called woke excess. We'll get at that a little bit later, but I did want to mention that. And before we're done in this hour, I do want to talk about this idea of a perpetual perpetual crisis. The Wall Street Journal talked about the perpetual COVID crisis, but it's worth mentioning that another one is a perpetual, if you will, so-called violence crisis. If you're not familiar, there were all sorts of people on high alert yesterday in the Capitol because supposedly on March 4th, which was the day in the past, which used to be the inauguration day, there was an argument that some militia groups were going to use that as kind of a QAnon inauguration day or something like that. Did anything happen? Of course not. Did anything happen during the whole question of the impeachment? No. Will anything happen in the future? No. Do you honestly think that those barricades are going to come down? Do you honestly think that the National Guard will come home? As a matter of fact, you have one general that was actually appointed by Nancy Pelosi who's given a recommendation that you would have a permanent structure there that could be put up quickly and that there would be a permanent housing of National Guard troops in perpetuity. So I want to talk about this idea of a perpetual crisis that is being used to promote so many ideas and so many policies, which quite frankly, can you imagine if Donald Trump had put a fence around the Capitol and called in National Guard troops because he was fearful of some of the anarchists or BLM? Do you think there would have been such a silence from the media as there is right now? And of course, you know the answer to that. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get to our first article. These we post because we encourage you to read them, maybe photocopy them, send them to others, and it all has to do with H.R. 1, which is an attempt to take what I've said before, some of the worst practices of election 2020 and now require every state to actually implement those. Yesterday, I actually posted a very good op-ed by the former Vice President, Mike Pence. There's been some people criticizing him, and as I've looked at the criticism, if I thought any of the criticisms were really important or valid, I would have posted them. But I think this piece by Kaylee McGee White is probably the best, because she says it is possible to believe that the 2020 election was fair and legitimate. She's holding that up as a hypothetical, and still understand that we need tighter voting requirements. She starts out by helping us understand that whether you believe that the election was stolen or that there was irregularities, or if you're one of those few that believe the election was on the up and up, it doesn't matter, because there's still a place for having better voter regulations. And she says the House then, of course, passed H.R. 1 on Thursday. That was last week, of course. That would essentially prevent states from passing any type of election reform and roll back a number of important voting requirements, such as voter ID laws. And she points out that the legislation would also mandate, as she points out, several controversial policies, including automatic and online voter registration and at least 2 weeks of early voting. It would bar state officials from purging voter rolls of ineligible voters, including deceased residents or residents who moved away from the system. And so, speaking before H.R. 1 was before the House vote, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, "This reminds me of what must have felt like at Valley Forge. Everything is at stake. We must win this race. We must fight." And so Kaylee says she has a point. This bill really is the Democratic Party's Hail Mary, because if it passes, Democrats will be able to nationalize election law and force every locality to play by its rules. Rules that would intentionally loosen voting regulations, opening up the potential for more fraud and abuse. And make no mistake, she says, H.R. 1 is the Democrats' attempt to rig the game and make sure they're always the ones in power. The title of her piece is H.R. 1 is the Democratic Party attempt to rig the game. So now when we come back from the break, I want to go into some detail on why she thinks that this could be used to rig the game. But you would hope that after all of the controversy surrounding the 2020 election, there would be people looking to try to apply the best practices from the election or previous elections, and instead this seems to want to actually apply the worst practices of the 2020 election. So we'll come back and talk more about that, and of course, most importantly, encourage you to contact your two senators about H.R. 1. We'll talk about rigging the game right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last 2 decades, Christian Smith has helped us understand what is in the heads and hearts of young people. He is the co-author of such books as Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, and Lost in Transition. In his books, he coined the now famous term moralistic therapeutic deism. The term came up in a discussion on my radio program with Kara Powell about her book, Growing Young. She and her co-authors have identified a number of strategies that will attract young people to your church. The term moralistic therapeutic deism came up in the discussion because it is a good way to identify the beliefs of so many youths and young adults. It includes 5 key points. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5th and finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Well, as you can see, this viewpoint is not exactly Orthodox Christianity, and it certainly does not encompass the gospel. Instead, young people want to be moral and also believe in a God who is removed from their daily lives. An important question is whether this moralistic therapeutic deism viewpoint in the heads of young people because of bad theological teaching or poor listening. The authors of Growing Young argue that it is probably both. Sometimes pastors have not taught good theology, but we also must admit that most young people today are captive to the culture. That is why we must work harder to teach a biblical worldview to adults and youth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First article here is one by Kaylee McGee White, who is a commentator for the Washington Examiner. And she raises a very good question. Is this controversial? Yes. Is it constitutional? Well, not necessarily. I'm holding in my hands right here a United States Constitution, and if you read the Constitution, and I know members of Congress should, but maybe haven't thought it through, she says, there's quite a bit of a debate about whether the bill is even constitutional. I side with those who argue it is not, and I would agree. The United States Constitution clearly gives state legislatures the right to dictate their own election policies. As I've said before on this program, we really don't have a national election. We have 50 state elections plus the District of Columbia, and that is really what is taking place. And the very different states have very different ways to vote. Some have mail-in balloting, some have early voting, some have certain kinds of requirements, and so that is a statewide function. So she points out that that is certainly found in the Constitution, and they have the right to dictate their election policies. Okay, how could liberals then try to declare this as constitutional in front of the Supreme Court? Well, there is a place where it says Congress has the power to to make or alter such regulations. But the implications of that is that if it only allowed white people to vote, only allowed men to vote, and there was a time when that was the case, right? You remember those days. Then the Congress obviously could step in and change something that was in the law that would be obviously in violation. But this has always been very, very limited in terms of the ability of Congress to change any of this. And the Electors Clause, actually in Article 2, Section 1, says that Congress has the final say over the timing of federal elections. But nowhere really in the Constitution does it say Congress can mandate the federal elections code for the states. So it's a really limited kind of opportunity. Not even when you go to the 15th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War, which bars racial discrimination in voting. So first of all, I'm not sure that even if H.R. 1 were passed by the Senate and signed, no doubt it would be signed by President Biden, that it would be declared constitutional by the Supreme Court. But let's not wait for that possibility. We've seen how sometimes people have said, oh, well, I think the Affordable Act will be declared unconstitutional. And then all of a sudden, Justice John Roberts looks like he changed his mind. So let's not start there. Let's encourage you to contact your 2 United States senators. She goes on to say that basically what's going on here is Democrats are trying to hide this attempted power grab behind what she calls a dishonest bad faith accusation that Republican states are attempting to disfranchise voters by restricting voter access. You always hear this phrase, voter suppression. And that's what she's talking about. She says Republican state legislatures are actually doing what they're constitutionally permitted to do, reversing election policies so that mail-in balloting, absentee voting should be less secure is a real concern. And so, if nothing else, a lot of it has to do with the issue of having a photo ID. And she points out very wisely that the vast majority of voters agree that some sort of voting security, like photo ID requirements, are necessary. And if you want to read my commentaries on this, you could go to pointofview.net, scroll to the bottom. There's a place where there's a search engine. You can type in voter ID or photo ID, and I take you through the long list of things that in a modern 21st century society, you need a photo ID for. And it's a lot of things, whether it's getting on an airplane, whether it's buying certain medically important substances, of course, whether it's to drive a car, whether it's to buy a house. I mean, just you go through this unbelievably long list. Back in the days when there was Blockbuster, you had to show a photo ID just to get a video. I mean, let's face it, this is what is required all the time. Try to cash a check without a photo ID, lots of luck in a lot of places. And so, again, we're not asking something that is an overwhelming burden. This is not voter suppression. This is living in the 21st century. But anyway, she points out in the conclusion that the Democratic Party used to agree with that as well. But H.R. 1 suggests that the party's opinion has changed. Perhaps she says it's just the cynic in me, but it's difficult to see this switch as anything but an attempt to take advantage towards mail-in voting and a variety of other actions that many times favor Democratic candidates. So anyway, this is one more article that we have posted. Yesterday, of course, I posted one by Vice President Mike Pence on H.R. 1. And if you go to our website right now, if you have not already done so, scroll down to near the bottom, and you'll see in that middle column it says Take Action for the People Act moves to the Senate. And this is H.R. 1, which would begin to expand many things which have been, to use the favorite word everybody loves to use, problematic, have been a real difficulty, have raised serious questions. And right now, while many state legislatures are trying to maybe shore up some of the things that are necessary so we have true voter integrity, this goes in the opposite direction. So if you click on Contact Your Senators, you'll see some information we have there. You can type in your zip code, and then we'll pop up your 2 senators. If you have done this before, it will already give your name, address, zip code, and everything. We already give you a suggested letter. You can edit it however you would like to do so. And then at the bottom, hit Submit. and that is a way for you to respond to this whole issue of H.R. 1, which will be considered by the United States Senate, and certainly, I believe, needs to be defeated. Meanwhile, the United States Senate is trying to figure out how to spend your money, which is why I wanted to move to the second article, which I've simply called America's Bankruptcy. Neil Patel, who is one of the individuals, actually one of the co-founders of the Daily Caller, writes about the fact that we have a debt problem in America and we don't seem to be addressing it. He reminds us that 10 years ago, we were, as a country, so focused on debt that then President Barack Obama was forced to set up a national commission to deal with it. And it was a bipartisan commission that had everybody from Erskine Bowles, who actually was in the Clinton administration, to a former Republican Senator Alan Simpson, with all sorts of recommendations. And he points out that when the Bowles-Simpson Commission was formed 10 years ago, the national debt was $13 trillion. Today, what is it? $27 trillion, more than double what it was 10 years ago. And as he points out, these numbers are so big that really nobody understands them. He says, to try to put this in perspective, let's recognize that our entire economic output last year, 2020, was $21 trillion. We're talking about a national debt of $27 trillion. He says if America could magically not spend a dime, that is, nobody bought anything, food, clothing, shelter, staples, whatever, and we put all of it towards paying off the federal debt for an entire year, we still wouldn't pay it off. And in more personal terms, our federal debt now amounts to more than $81,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country, or $227,000 for the average household in America. So we ask a very important question. If the problem is twice as bad as it was 10 years ago, why don't we even discuss it anymore? And so I want to come back from the break and talk about that. But I'll also get your comments, because we have talked about the national debt even back in the 1980s, when the national debt, when Ronald Reagan came into office, was $1 trillion, was about $2 trillion almost when Ronald Reagan left office. And I've talked about this before with Chuck Bentley, because he, of course, replaced Larry Burkett. Some of us remember in the 1980s, Larry Burkett talked about the coming economic earthquake. And I think he was right. He was just off by a few decades, because the build down of the military-industrial complex with the drop of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and the growth of the internet kind of postponed the inevitable. But we've been postponing the inevitable for a long, long time. And we come back from the break, I might even hold up our booklet on debt, because I spend part of the time talking about the debt of America. Sad reality is, I think one of the reasons why we don't talk about debt is because Americans are in debt as well. And it's important for us to get out of debt. And we've even more recently talked with our friend Chuck Bentley about the 7 gray swans. One of those, of course, is modern monetary fund, modern monetary theory, in which you really have an emphasis that says, well, we don't have to worry about deficits. We can create money out of thin air. There is going to be a reckoning, I suspect, fairly soon about that. And so we're going to come back and talk about this issue of bankruptcy. But what are your thoughts? Are you concerned about the debt load of America? 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot of issues to cover, and we'd love to hear your comments right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. At a time when the United States Senate is looking to spend $1.9 trillion, only a fraction of that actually is going to go to help people that have been devastated by the pandemic and lockdowns. You've got to ask a fundamental question about bankruptcy of the United States and the national debt and those kinds of issues, which is the second article we've posted here today. So we want to get some of your comments about that, and we will get those in just a minute. But let me just be fair to say that this is if you will, a little hidden secret, and that is that when Republicans are in power, Democrats sometimes talk about the deficit. When Democrats are in power, Republicans spend a lot of time talking about the deficit. But again, it's just sort of one of those issues where if you're particular party's not in power, then maybe you bring it up, but nobody else does. And my concern has been that we're not even talking about it anymore. At least there was an attempt to say that we are concerned about it 10 years ago. As Neil Patel points out, that's not even being discussed. I even pointed out more than 4 years ago that neither Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump were really talking about ending the deficit or trying to even balance the budget. This last time you didn't see Joe Biden or Donald Trump talk about it either. I mean, Donald Trump would say, well, we want to try to grow out of it. There are some individuals to be giving credit where credit is due. I think of Rand Paul comes to mind as an individual that has many times talked about the penny plan. What is that? We won't spend any more on government, but we'll drop 1 penny out of every dollar. And in 5 years, that was 10 years ago, I think you could actually balance the budget. Now, I think I heard him say the other day, it's not 1 penny, it's 2 pennies, it's 3 pennies. And then even if you take, in other words, 3%, in other words, you don't grow any of the government budgets at all, not even for any kind of cost of living, and you cut it 3%. There's not a snowflake's chance, unfortunately, that will probably happen. It would still take 5 years to get a balanced budget, and you'd still be then carrying $27 trillion of debt year after year after year. So that's the issue. But let's take some phone calls and give you a chance to express your opinion. Let me just mention that I do address much of this in my booklet on debt. And that deals, first of all, with the government debt and then personal debt as well. And then what does the Bible have to say about debt? But let's take some phone calls. We'll go, first of all, to Illinois. And Barry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good afternoon. I listened to the program on, I can't remember the call letters, but I believe it's 1370 AM out of Lincoln, Illinois. My comment is that I'm not understanding why the American people continue to vote these politicians in office. And I have a reason for saying that. Year after year, every 2 or 4 years, when we know they're a bunch of liars for the most part, and they don't keep their word, and they're just in it for the most part to go and make money or save money for their retirement if they ever have it. But I'm not understanding why the American people cannot go and cut their own expenses down. I'm a single man. I just have my very basic expenses. I don't live extravagantly, and I'm able to save money. I don't use credit cards. I pay for everything with cash, and I'm able to save a little bit. And because I look at it, the Bible talks about just for today. Nobody has a guarantee of tomorrow.
That's right.
And so having food and raiment, therewith be content. And if more people, and I'm not begrudging anybody having things. I think it's a blessing that God does give, and I am very thankful when the Lord gives other people, even in my own family, things, whether it's a newer home or a newer vehicle or whatever, and that's a blessing. But the way I live, I wouldn't expect anybody else to live that way. But if people wanted to go and be able to help themselves, be able to have money and not have to, okay, well, I've got student loan debt for my kids, and so I'm going to end up having to spend years paying that off. If people just use wisdom and follow, even And I'm talking about Christians mainly, because a lot of unsaved people, the Lord's not going to be able to really reach them until they actually get saved and give them more wisdom on
Sure.
that. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for letting me make that comment.
Well, you made a very good one. And again, of course, the scriptures are very replete about the dangers of debt. Proverbs 22:7, the rich rule over the poor, but the borrower is a servant to the lender, probably a better translation, a slave to the lender. And so you can see there are some real consequences when you're in debt. And Barry was talking about the level of debt, because in this book I talk about we have about $1 trillion of credit card debt. We have about $1 trillion of auto loan debt. Now, I recognize that in some cases, that at least is an asset, a depreciating asset, but at least an asset, which is different than credit card. Student loan debt, you mentioned a minute ago, $1.5 trillion and climbing. Well, again, you can see why some people want to go in debt, because then they want to have the incoming president now. Certainly what Joe Biden has talked about, Bernie Sanders in the past has talked about, and that is forgiving debt, college debt, and even making college free. So you can see all of those ideas as well. But Barry, back to the kind of the national issue, one of the things Neil Patel says is that we've always, as Americans, had the goal of leaving things better for your kids. He says that's as American as apple pie. But he says we're not doing that anymore. And part of that has to do with something I mentioned just in passing, and we talked about with Chuck Bentley of Crown Financial, and that is modern monetary theory, which is the belief that deficits and debts don't matter. And so you can just print more money. But of course, you know what that's going to mean. That means when you have more money for the same number of goods, the dollars in your pocket, the dollars in your wallet, the dollars in your purse are going to be worth less tomorrow than they are today. And of course, Barry mentioned something else, and that is politicians, if they want to get reelected, they want to keep taxes low and spending high. And so you have a debt crisis, which is going to continue. And the only answer around that is to either borrow more money. But what happens when we can't borrow anymore from the Chinese, the Saudis, the Japanese, even from Americans? Well, then we're just going to have to print money. At that point, it gets pretty difficult. And, of course, the interest on the debt off the charts, which brings me to Elmer calling in from Alaska. He wants to talk about whether or not we have a financial system that actually encourages debt. So, Elmer, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good morning. Thanks for taking the call. And I was interested to hear Rand Paul's idea. I hadn't heard that before. But there are probably one of the things is about the Federal Reserve System, how the banking system creates money for our economic system by loaning money into the system rather than printing
yes,
so much. And this ends up was kind of set up on a fractional reserve system where banks can loan money that they don't actually have, but on the premise that it's going to be repaid. And there is a theory, a plan or an idea, and it was promulgated after the Depression. It was called the Chicago Plan that separated the monetary function of banking and the credit and banking function of loaning money. And it wasn't accepted, and there were various other reforms, and one of which was repealed in Mr. Clinton's administration, the Glass-Steagall thing about banking being separated. And so there is a plan out there suggested by the American Monetary Institute, and but it does take time to be installed, and of course there would be a lot of politics and discussion about the whole thing, and so it has a long idea. And if things get bad enough, maybe then people will realize that they need to come to the table and set up a system where we're not on a fractional reserve system.
Sure. I need to take a break, but first of all, I want to thank you for sending some of that information and, this idea of true money, but going all the way back to a Chicago plan and even the whole issue of the Federal Reserve. It's about time, I think, we have to do another program on the Federal Reserve System, about the banking system. The Chicago plan was an attempt by actually an economist at the University of Chicago after what had happened in the Great Depression and after you had implemented the Federal Reserve under Woodrow Wilson to reevaluate all sorts of things, and somewhere along the line we are going to have a crash, and if we don't, at least the only way to avoid it is to have some people getting serious about dealing with the deficits and the national debt. But let me continue that conversation because there's some other points that Neil Patel makes, and I want to talk about that. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
It's well known that Planned Parenthood is the nation's largest abortion provider, supplying over half of all reported U.S. abortions. But the organization's annual report shows that it's also the second largest provider of hormone therapy to individuals who identify as transgender or who have gender dysphoria. Although this is called gender-affirming hormone therapy, there's no effort to affirm anyone's biological gender. This therapy involves providing physically healthy teenagers with hormones designed to interfere with the natural progression of puberty. Teens seeking gender transition are given cross-sex hormones to develop the secondary sex characteristics of the gender they identify with. So boys start to grow breasts, girls begin to get facial hair and lower voices. Mary Zook, director of the Center for Human Dignity at Family Research Council, points out that these medications can have lifelong health consequences, including interference with brain development, inhibition of normal bone density development, and sterilization. Yet teenage girls are arriving at clinics, often in groups, seeking and receiving these drugs. Journalist Abigail Schreier is the author of Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Her interview with a former Planned Parenthood employee revealed how shockingly easy it is for teens to get cross-sex hormone therapy at certain Planned Parenthood clinics. This former clinic worker told Ms. Schreier 1 to 2 new biologically female teen patients would arrive seeking testosterone per day. There were no doctors at this particular clinic. A gender counselor would ask a few questions, and an off-site mental health professional who would never actually see or speak with the patient would sign off. The clinic employee told Abigail Schreier that unlike abortion-minded women, trans-identifying kids are cash cows, and they are kept on the hook for the foreseeable future in terms of follow-up appointments, blood work, meetings, etc. No surprise here, Planned Parenthood is following the money. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll stay on the subject of debt and the national debt and $1.9 trillion just about being spent by the United States Senate and signed by President Joe Biden. And if you have some thoughts about that, I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Elmer just said he hadn't heard about the penny plan. I've talked about this before, but it's been a while, and people tune in in and tune out. I don't expect you to remember everything we talk about on Point of View. So let's talk about that for a minute, because I found a very good piece that was posted by Rand Paul, who is a senator from Kentucky. And he pointed out that when he first started suggesting how we could balance the budget, he originally, and this was 4 years ago, said that back then, if we were to just freeze the budget, not spend any more than we spent last year, which would be considered by every liberal progressive in the world as a cut, because only in Washington, D.C., when you don't naturally have an increase, it's called a cut. That only happens in Washington, D.C. If you spend the same amount of money this year as you did last year for your family budget, nobody would call that a cut in spending. You just say, I spent the same amount that I did last year. So he first proposed a freeze in spending. Then as the deficits got so high, he said, well, then he started to do what was called the penny plan. If we just take 1 penny out of every dollar, in other words, we reduce spending by 1%, we would eventually balance the budget. I think even back then it was 5 years. Now he's gone to 2, and now the most recent one, he just posted this February 4th, is, again, if we were to cut it 3%, 3 pennies on the dollar, in 5 years we would balance it. So you can see it's increasing more and more time, and we are getting worse and worse. And if nothing else, as Neil Patel points out, what will happen in a debt crisis? Why are we ignoring this obvious and impending catastrophe? What should we do about it? He says at some point we will, of course, continue to borrow money. The interest we pay on debt will be so high that we'll not be able to afford the rest of the budget. And that's where you are going to have the crisis or a crash or whatever you want to call it at that point, when all of a sudden one day you have to pay less for Social Security payments or less for welfare payments or whatever. Or you start realizing what that happens. And of course, we won't do that because it's politically untenable. So we're just going to start printing money, and then you're going to have inflation taking off there as well. And says we are basically ignoring our looming debt crisis because it's not a winner politically. He says both parties, I appreciate him saying this, are the problem. The Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations will all be to blame. Republicans, traditionally the party of fiscal responsibility, have lost all credibility on the issue. After shutting down the government over spending under Obama, they spent happily on record levels under Trump. And so if you're looking for someone to blame, you can blame Republicans and Democrats, Republican Congresses, Democratic Congresses, Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. But let's, if we can, take some time to get a few more of your phone calls. We'll head up to Michigan. And I think, Bob, you'd like to add something to the conversation. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's fine that I could be in, and I appreciate your efforts on what you're doing. You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
So in our town in Michigan, we started seeing the first time around the stimulus money going to people. And we found out later on that about a third of it was actually going to people that needed it. The other 2/3 was either going in the bank or spent on frivolous things and going to a bar or going to a dance or something like this. So we started talking to each other. Well, why don't we just take this money? We don't need it. Let's put it in the pot. We'll designate the Salvation Army as a fiduciary that will got trustworthiness to spend it and trustworthiness to collect it. So we started doing this, and we found out that people get a lot more satisfaction out of giving than they do out of taking.
Good for you.
So we had a real people that all I had to do is ask them, how much do you want? So this is what we started doing, and we're giving the money away. We're not lending it or anything like this. We give it to people that somebody knows. I know this lady that's got a shop and she can't pay her own rent. She's trying to keep open. So we gave her some money. A restaurant, a very popular one, but some of their equipment broke down. They couldn't stay open. So they've been spending the last year trying to figure out how am I going to open up again. And many people like this. So and people got the satisfaction of it. And they say, well, listen, I know this lady down the street. She would love to give this money. You call her up, and I know she'll give a big chunk of dough. And this has been going on now for maybe only about 3 months. But try it. I think everybody that's had money, they've tried different things to satisfy themselves, of course, in a home and a car. But after that, they had schooling, but they started thinking about, well, what do we really want to use our money for? Sometimes you don't know, or you don't have any real needs. Well, give it away. And
sure.
It's very satisfying. I guess that's my message.
It's a great message. I've done some of this through my own Sunday school class or through our own individual giving, but the way in which you could put together as a community pot. Again, I'm so concerned about sending money to people that don't need it. Even the Paycheck Protection Plan going to institutions that shouldn't have received it in the first place. These are just good examples of the malfeasance of the federal government, and you've come up with a creative way to address that. So, Bob, congratulations, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
Well, I hope other people, if they want to call me, I'm in Cadillac, Michigan, and I'd be happy to talk to them about starting something up in their own hometown and telling them what we're doing so they can see we're actually doing something. There's actually people out there that got going broke, and they really need it, and when they get it, my wife saw one at the post office, and he said, Sue, wow, I couldn't believe that I got this money that I could finally know I wasn't going to go belly up. So it's thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so very much for giving us that idea. For those of you that want to join the conversation, can we let you just stay on the line, and we'll catch you at the next hour, because some of you want to talk about this issue of debt, and I try to cover it from time to time, and especially since we're talking about spending $1.9 trillion on, in some cases, things that are not going to be helpful to the people that Bob was talking about, that are actually just attempts to once again use a crisis to increase spending. And if you don't have our booklet on debt, that is one that I certainly would want to make available to you, because it's not saying anything you probably couldn't learn from, of course, Chuck Bentley or a variety of other individuals that are Christian counselors on the subject of debt, but it kind of helps you understand the level of personal debt, the level of government debt, and some of the real issues that we need to be addressing. And so this part by Neil Patel, it's the second article. You can read it in its entirety. I've only been quoting from pieces of the article that he wrote in the Daily Caller. But as always, we've posted it on our website at pointofview.net. We come back from the break. Let me talk a little bit more about this issue of debt, the national debt, the penny plan, and some of that. And then I want to get into a couple of other articles. One of those having to do with the fact that so-called woke excess is causing a lot of minority voters to flee the Democratic Party. Some are going to the Republican Party. Some are just simply not voting, but they just can't even abide some of the things happening in terms of the social justice warriors. I want to talk about this perpetual COVID crisis and how a crisis is being used all the day to advance agenda items that we disagree with. But as we go to a break, a good time for you to find some of these articles. And if you haven't already clicked on that button that says Take Action, that's the assignment for those of you today. If you've already done so, well, you might get some of these articles. Send them to your elected representatives and say, what in the world is going on? We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is Weekend Edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Don't take as many phone calls on a Friday, because oftentimes we have Kelly Shackelford or Dr. Merrill Matthews, Penna Dexter, whoever it might be. We are so busy hearing from them, but we want to hear from you, and especially when I'm talking about the subject of debt, this booklet that we've made available for you in the past, and you're welcome to order a copy of it, reminds us of what the Bible says about debt, some of the consequences of debt, and then all the different forms of debt. And I have said before, but it's worth saying again, because after all, you don't always tune in every day, that I think one of the reasons why we don't hold our elected officials accountable about the rising debt is we actually enjoy all the benefits that we get from government, and we feel maybe slightly hypocritical pointing out that the federal government's in debt, because we can't point fingers because we're in debt too. And it is amazing how many Americans are under some load of debt, whether it's, debt which is maybe possibly appreciating, which would be house debt. You know, your mortgage debt's a little different because you have an appreciating asset many times, but car debt was a depreciating asset, or credit card debt, which is gone, or student loan debt, or all sorts of other issues. So again, that gets us into the subject of debt. And if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you just joined us, we spent some time talking in the first hour about how H.R. 1 could be used to rig elections, why we encourage you to take action. Second article on America's bankruptcy and the subject of debt. And then I'm going to move on to some of the other articles. And one in particular, before we end this hour, I want to talk about how a pollster for liberal progressive organizations is saying, we in the Democratic Party are losing minorities because of what he calls woke excess. All this woke, all this cancel culture, all these social justice warriors, all this talk about defunding the police, they're leaving us. Now, whether they go to the Republican Party depends on whether or not people that maybe are running the Republican Party are welcoming them or doing what they can to drive them away. But it's an interesting phenomenon that is being talked about. And before we're done, I want to talk about a piece that the Wall Street Journal editors have talked about, the perpetual COVID crisis. If you think that the lockdowns and all the restrictions are going to go away anytime soon, if you think the fence around the Capitol is going to go down anytime soon, I've got other kind of news for you. But let's take some more phone calls and give you a chance to join the conversation. We'll head to South Carolina. WAGP Forrest, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good day, Kirby. May you be blessed.
Well, thank you for calling.
Yes. Yeah, well, I love your show. I was reading the Federal Register out of the state of Florida, and anyone can look it up, and you can see that the central bank actually filed for bankruptcy. Now, isn't the central bank the main controlling financial for our country?
Well, and I, even knowing that you were going to talk about that, I looked it up, and I couldn't find that in any kind of news story. So if you have some of that information, I'd like to see it, because there are some central banks that in other countries that have done that. But if it's talking about the central bank in South Carolina, for example, that's one thing. If it's a central bank for the Federal Reserve, as we jokingly say, the Federal Reserve is a misnomer because, first of all, it's not a federal agency and it has doubtful reserves because in some respects you could see that if the country's bankrupt, they're bankrupt as well. And our rating economically has dropped precipitously simply because we have a debt load now of $27 trillion. So it doesn't take long to see that we, in some respects, on paper, are bankrupt. But I would love to see if you can find that.
Well, if you look online, type in Federal Register for bankruptcy in the state of Florida, and it's the Central Bank of London, which the Rothschilds own. I mean, like I said, just go. That's all you have to do is Federal Registry, bankruptcy, and it'll pull it completely up for you, and you can see where the Central Bank of London has filed for bankruptcy, which actually started giving us our loans back in 1871, and they were due in 1913. And because our country couldn't pay for it, bonds were reissued, and next thing you know, that's when the tax system come in. And that's in just basic history. Anyone can pull that up as well. And that's when the United States started having all these income tax, this tax, and all the other tax.
There you go.
And I just find it strange that the central bank can go with their fiat system, can go bankrupt, which is actually the leading lender in the whole world. And, it just draws up a lot of questions.
Well, it does. And now that I understand what you're talking about, when I realized you were talking about the Central Bank of London, I did pull up something from The Guardian here. Britain nearly went bust in March, says the Bank of England. So there you go. So that was from a year ago. So I know what you're talking about now in terms of that financial emergency. I was thinking you were talking about the Central Bank of the Federal Reserve. But yes, that actually is a story that is up there.
Well, that's where most of our debt is.
Yeah, that is true.
It's with the Central Bank in London.
Well, again, also, of course,
and
all of our friends at the Federal Reserve.
What are they going to try to do to us?
Yes. Well, there you go. Well, now that I understand what you're talking about, yes, that is a story out there, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So, Forrest, as I've said before, we have as many reporters as we have listeners to Point of View, and you are one of those. So thank you for educating me on that.
Oh, man, you educate me every day. You flatter me, Kerby.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We need to take a break here, and Forrest is talking about the Central Bank of London. By the way, we were just off air talking about this. My producer, Steve, and I were saying, we have done programs on the Federal Reserve. It has been a while. I recognize I have a whole new generation of young people that say, I'm not sure I even know how we have a Federal Reserve. I mean, we used to have a national bank, and then you remember Andrew Jackson, one of his lines was, we killed the bank. And so from the time of Andrew Jackson to 1913, we did not have a national bank. And then, of course, you have the men going on a train to Jekyll Island. Maybe you know that story. And eventually getting this idea of the Federal Reserve created under Woodrow Wilson. And, of course, we have that today. And we haven't covered that story in some time. So maybe we'll get into some of that as well. I think Elmer called about that. And I was kind of thinking Federal Reserve when Forrest called. And I realized, no, he's talking about the Central Bank of London. And, again, all sorts of people own our debt. China, I think, is number one, but you also can have Japan, you have England, you have Saudi Arabia. You also have a number of other countries that are not easily identified because they're kind of in a coalition. And then, of course, you have Americans owning the debt as well. The line used to be, well, we don't have to worry about debt because, after all, we own the debt. No, not any longer. Yes, you buy savings bonds and things like that, but we don't own as much of that debt as you would think. And what happens if those other countries decide to call in their debt someday, call in the loans? And that's a big issue, and it's just one more question that nobody wants to talk about. But I want to talk about it here on Point of View, especially when we're about ready to spend $1.9 trillion, and not all of it, very significant amount of it, has nothing to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last 2 decades, Christian Smith has helped us understand what is in the heads and hearts of young people. He is the co-author of such books as Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, and Lost in Transition. In his books, he coined the now famous term moralistic therapeutic deism. The term came up in a discussion on my radio program with Kara Powell about her book, Growing Young. She and her co-authors have identified a number of strategies that will attract young people to your church. The term moralistic therapeutic deism came up in the discussion because it is a good way to identify the beliefs of so many youths and young adults. It includes 5 key points. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5th and finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Well, as you can see, this viewpoint is not exactly Orthodox Christianity, and it certainly does not encompass the gospel. Instead, young people want to be moral and also believe in a God who is removed from their daily lives. An important question is whether this moralistic therapeutic deism viewpoint in the heads of young people because of bad theological teaching or poor listening. The authors of Growing Young argue that it is probably both. Sometimes pastors have not taught good theology, but we also must admit that most young people today are captive to the culture. That is why we must work harder to teach a biblical worldview to adults and youth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention real quickly that when we've been talking about the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, I haven't given you a percentage, but I think I should warn you not to use the 9% figure. That one has had some currency out there, and the 9% figure, first of all, I knew that was too low because that's only looking at the actual cost of vaccines and a few other things. You can come up with another 12% that talks about helping people on a variety of different ways, and some of them have to do with the payments and various loans and all the rest. But at the same time, the highest percentage I've seen is there was kind of a, quote, independent fact checker group that said, oh, no, about 85% of the $1.9 trillion goes to COVID-related. Well, yes, but that's using saying, well, that individuals that are receiving all sorts of payments, and I can look at my list again here of subsidizing COBRA for laid-off workers, Affordable Care Act subsidies, expanding nutrition assistance, all those kinds of things. Some of that is COVID in the broadest sense of the word. But isn't that interesting? The highest percentage they could get up with was 85% is going to COVID-related expenses, which right off the bat tells you, well, then there's 15% of $1.9 trillion, you can do the math, that isn't and is obviously, I think most people would call pork. So somewhere between the 9% and 85% is probably an accurate figure. I don't really care. The point I'm making is that as happens with every single piece of legislation. As soon as you get a must-pass piece of legislation, whether it's the funding of the military, whether it's keeping the government solvent, raising the debt ceiling, whatever it is, there's always all sorts of extra pork added to it. I like to use the example, it's like a Christmas tree. We'll just add a few more ornaments to it. So don't use the 9% figure. If you want to use the 85% figure, I don't believe that one either. But whatever number you want to use, it illustrates again that there is a very deliberate attempt to do this. And one of the reasons, let's give credit where credit is due. Today we've given credit to Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. Let's give credit to, again, Senator from Wisconsin, who also is asking for Congress to read the bill. And so this has taken a while for the United States Senate to vote on the bill or even consider amendments, because Ron Johnson from Wisconsin said, yeah, we're going to have you read the bill. And so they've been reading the bill. And maybe the first time some of these members of Congress, at least in the United States Senate, found out what's in the bill. Remember the old phrase? Didn't Nancy Pelosi one time say, we got to pass the bill to know what's in the bill? Don't you know? I mean, that is certainly the case. Rest well, America. Let's go on to some other issues. And if you would like to address these, that is the case. And if not, I will have some other things we want to put on the table. But the third article we've posted for you today, this comes from a writer that actually writes for Reason Magazine, Robbie Shoav, and he actually is quoting from a progressive pollster. This is a pollster, David Shore. He's done polling for Democratic Party, liberal progressive caucuses and things like that. I'm just going to read part of the article because it illustrates only so much what is happening right now in the Democratic Party. Because while he says, the Democratic pulled off a complete, albeit narrow, victory over Donald Trump, and he's just conceding that that was the case. Nevertheless, Democrats lost ground with non-white voters, despite significantly raising the idea of racial justice issues during the campaign. And he says, according to pollster, a progressive pollster, probably a better way to say it, David Shore, it's time to face the facts. David Shore says the cultural views of the very highly educated, very left-leaning white people are toxic for many non-white voters who would otherwise support the Democratic Party. That's kind of a summary of what he says from Robbie Shove. And then he specifically says, now quoting from David Shore in this interview in New York Magazine, I don't think a lot of people expected Donald Trump's Republican Party to have a much more diverse support base than Mitt Romney did in 2012. But that's what happened. Again, for all the attempts to say that Donald Trump was a racist and minorities would be crazy to vote for him, he actually has a more diverse support base than Mitt Romney did. Then Shore pointed out two specific associations. The one is socialism, which we may talk about later here, and the other was the defund the police movement. He says those two associations appear to have tarnished the Democratic Party in eyes of these minority voters. The former is unsurprising finding because, after all, socialism has not necessarily been real popular, especially with, he points out here, Hispanic voters, because if they especially have anybody that's related to them in Venezuela or Cuba, they got pretty strong ideas about socialism. But he says the latter, that is the defund the police, is also noteworthy because he said it was a mantra recited by progressive activists who were supposedly trying to represent the wishes of racial minorities. He says these activists claim, for instance, that the role of police in society is to defend and legitimize America's white supremacist culture. In other words, the activists want to defund the police because they think they're doing it as a necessary component of the anti-racist organizing. But again, this article points out the trouble is these racial minorities don't actually share that view. And this, again, quoting from David Shore, because he is, again, a progressive pollster. So his quote is, "We raise the salience of an ideologically charged issue that millions of non-white voters disagreed with us on." He goes on to say, and then, as a result, these conservative Hispanic voters who've been voting for us despite their ideological inclinations started voting more like conservative whites. He also says that this holds true for the highly specific way that white elite liberals talk about race in general. Again, let me give you another quote from, again, David Shore. He says, "In elite circles, racism has been defined in highly ideological terms, and this theological perspective on what racism means and the nature of racial inequality have become a big part of the group identity of college-educated Democrats, white and non-white, but it's not necessarily how non-white working-class people understand racism. If you look at concrete questions, white liberals are to the left of Hispanic Democrats, also of black Democrats, on defunding the police and those ideological questions about the source of racial inequity." And he says it's fairly clear, that is, the article says, that based on the polling done by David Shore, that Ivy League educated white liberals' messaging on assortment of issues fall under the category of what is called woke excess. And that is driving up, and has in the past driven up, minority voters in the arms of former President Donald Trump. That wasn't enough to give Trump a second term, as this article points out, but it probably helped Republicans dramatically improve their position in what? The House of Representatives. If you remember, every one of those contested races, Republicans won, and they came back and won a number of seats away from Democrats. And of course, if you keep saying socialism and defund the police, guess what? Some of those traditional voters that have gone for the Democrats just immediately go for the Republicans, and that's what's taken place. So finally, the article goes on to say, woke excess goes by many names, including political correctness run amok, which he says I previously claimed was a non-trivial explanation for Trump's surprise win in 2016. It also drives cancel culture. This week we've talked about Dr. Seuss. We've talked about Mr. Potato Head. We've talked about removing the book When Harry Became Sally by Dr. Ryan Anderson. The list is so long, I won't have time before we take our next break to talk about all of those. And if nothing else, it illustrates again the excess that is now driving many individuals who have been sort of traditional voters for the Democrats towards the Republicans. And some of you that are Democrats for some time might say, you know, this Democratic Party is not the Democrat of my party of my father or my mother. It's not even the Democratic one I remember even a few years ago under Bill Clinton. And so as some of these minority votes are actually fleeing, you're going to see some others fleeing as well. So I thought it would be really appropriate, if nothing else, to put that article on the table. We come back, we'll take some more phone calls. Maybe you have some thoughts about this, and we'll get into this idea of trying to use a crisis to always do what you can to promote an agenda. And the editors of the Wall Street Journal talk about the perpetual COVID crisis. We'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Weekend edition, and I thought we'd step back a little bit and look at the broader issue because, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the editors of the Wall Street Journal have a piece which is entitled "The Perpetual COVID crisis. If I had told you this time, even last year when we were hearing about the pandemic, that the various governors would close down the states, that your church would no longer meet, that there would not be any in-person services during Easter, you might think, even as we were in the month of March, thinking I had lost my mind. And yet we saw that the so-called 15 days, we'll lock everything down, became 45 days, became 6 months, became almost 9 months for some of you that are listening right now. And it is a perpetual crisis. And so it's just one example, which I'm going to focus on looking at the pandemic and the lockdown and the vaccines. Earlier in the week, we, of course, talked about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and some people have some moral questions about that. But I want to move beyond that issue, and that is where I also talked about the fact that there were supposed to be some guidelines that came down from the CDC about if you've been vaccinated, then what are we going to say? Because the evidence is pretty clear that you still might possibly, even after vaccination, have a little bit of what's called a viral load if by chance you get it. But in most cases, you're going to eliminate it very quickly. And so there's no evidence that we can see if we look at the scientific and medical research that you would be any likely a super spreader. So it would seem to me that if you have the vaccine, and we have millions of Americans now that have had the vaccine, right, that they should be able to just kind of go and be free. And that's why the CDC, I think, does not want to put that out there, because they don't want to let people be free. Now, it may not necessarily be them. It might be politicians. Of course, some people have said it might create a two-tier society. Those of you with the vaccines get all your rights and privileges back, and those of you that don't. That wouldn't be good. But I think it illustrates the point I'm going to make here by the editors of the Wall Street Journal. And they would be generally conservative, although sometimes you wonder. And then I want to quote from a very strong liberal who's essentially saying the same thing. Because it's always helpful when we hear from people who wouldn't necessarily agree with much of what we talk about here around the table, who nevertheless come to the same conclusions we do. But first of all, let's go to the editors of the Wall Street Journal. They said President Biden's announcement this week that the U.S. should have enough vaccines to inoculate every adult American by the end of May brought hope of a return to normalcy. That apparently is prehistoric thinking, they say. And what you have here is President Biden saying the last thing we need is Neanderthal thinking. Now, he was saying that because of the decision by the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, also the governor of Mississippi, I might mention, but he was poking fun mostly of Greg Abbott, that this is all Neanderthal thinking. And I love what Gary Bauer said. You know, you want to know what Neanderthal thinking is, it's opening our borders during a pandemic. Neanderthal thinking is keeping our kids out of school in spite of the damage being done to them educationally and emotionally. He says Neanderthal thinking is keeping our churches closed in violation of the First Amendment. Neanderthal thinking is failing to prioritize the elderly for vaccines in the name of equity. You know how we want to focus on racial issues. And Neanderthal thinking is turning our nursing homes into killing fields. So you can kind of look at Neanderthal thinking two ways, but nevertheless, that's what he has said. And just imagine if, as they said here, Donald Trump had attacked Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's lockdown as Neanderthal thinking. But he's able to say it, get away with it, and everybody laughs at it. And it was played time and time again on MSNBC and CNN and all the rest. Okay, let's go back to the editorial. They say that vaccination rates in Texas and other states have been increasing while hospitalizations are plunging. About 1 in 5 adults in Texas have received at least one dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Most are seniors, people with health conditions who are at the highest risk of severe illnesses. Hospitalizations in Texas have fallen more than 60% since the mid-January peak. These are all numbers you would not hear if you listen to the mainstream press. Let's give credit to Wall Street Journal, which is sort of the mainstream press, but a little more on the conservative side, obviously. So then the editors go on and say, look, politicians have created a box canyon with lockdowns last spring that were originally intended to flatten the curve. But then every time governors loosened restrictions and cases ticked up, well, then Democrats would demand lockdowns. Not that lockdowns or mask mandates much helped California or New York, which experienced bigger surges this winter than Florida did with neither, which is something to remember because the mainstream press has gone out of its way to protect, well, up until now, the governors of California and New York, and have vilified the governor of Florida and even the governor of Texas. Then the point that they make is vaccinations and vaccines were supposed to enable Americans more or less to get back to their before COVID lives. That would be youth sports, eating out, family gatherings, even walking outside without a mask. It's probably still prudent to wear masks in public settings indoors for a few more months, and businesses like Starbucks and Target plan to continue requiring them. They may never pull those back down. We'll see. But then the editors go on to say that liberals and their public health friends don't seem to want the pandemic to end ever. Some lockdown advocates are warning that a myriad new gene variants may be more infectious, though it's unclear if they are, and could render vaccines less effective. They warn that vaccinated individuals might still transmit the virus if they are asymptomatic, though the probability is low. And I've looked briefly, I can't say I've looked at a lot, but I did look at a couple studies that have come down. And at the best, they say some might have a little bit of a viral load, but probably not going to be super spreaders even in that case. So then they go on to say that pandemic restrictions, they say, the liberals say, and the others, must be maintained until we achieve herd immunity, which the experts also say may never happen because of new, more transmittable variants and the potential for reinfection. This eternal public health crisis is unsustainable politically and economically. Washington can't keep passing trillion-dollar spending bills with jobless benefits, food stamps, cash payments, rent subsidies, and other welfare to help the unemployed and many gainfully employed Americans. Forget the mental health toll on people who have been cooped up for a year. But he says Democrats seem pleased that they can use the pandemic to expand the welfare state. Some are now demanding recurring stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits tied to economic conditions. This crisis is far from over, and families deserve certainty that they can put food on their table and keep roof over their heads. And that's what 10 senators that are all Democrats wrote to Joe Biden this week. Meanwhile, they're preparing a giant climate infrastructure spending bill they say is urgently needed to jolt the economy and save the planet. Behold how the COVID crisis bleeds into the climate crisis. And just before we take a break, let me just mention that one of my commentaries coming out next week is somebody I've mentioned before, and that is Naomi Wolf. If you don't know who she is, she's a very well-known liberal feminist. She worked on Bill Clinton's re-election campaign. She said she voted for Joe Biden, but she says she's starting to have regret. If you're not familiar with her, not only has she written about feminism, a while back, she wrote a book about the totalitarian regimes around the world, and she outlined 10 steps that would-be tyrants always take when they want to close down a democracy. And she said she never really expected that she'd ever be writing about this in this country, because she says whether they're from the right or the left, these dictators almost always follow these 10 steps. But one of the most ominous things she has said is that she believes that America has now arrived at step number 10. This comes from a liberal, feminist, secular kind of mind. I assume secular. I don't know all about that, although I think she did talk about some churches, so I won't get into all those details, in which she actually says that we're now at the issue of the suspension of rule of law, and the real concern that once you give these emergency powers to many of these politicians, they never want to give it back. And she is as concerned about the future of America as we are, and yet she obviously comes from a very different point of view. So as the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out, this is kind of a perpetual crisis. And these crises have been used for some time to advance an agenda, and that seems to be taking place right now. We'll be right back.
It's well known that Planned Parenthood is the nation's largest abortion provider, supplying over half of all reported U.S. abortions. But the organization's annual report shows that it's also the second largest provider of hormone therapy to individuals who identify as transgender or who have gender dysphoria. Although this is called gender-affirming hormone therapy, there's no effort to affirm anyone's biological gender. This therapy involves providing physically healthy teenagers with hormones designed to interfere with the natural progression of puberty. Teens seeking gender transition are given cross-sex hormones to develop the secondary sex characteristics of the gender they identify with. So boys start to grow breasts, girls begin to get facial hair and lower voices. Mary Zook, director of the Center for Human Dignity at Family Research Council, points out that these medications can have lifelong health consequences, including interference with brain development, inhibition of normal bone density development, and sterilization. Yet teenage girls are arriving at clinics, often in groups, seeking and receiving these drugs. Journalist Abigail Schreier is the author of Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Her interview with a former Planned Parenthood employee revealed how shockingly easy it is for teens to get cross-sex hormone therapy at certain Planned Parenthood clinics. This former clinic worker told Ms. Schreier 1 to 2 new biologically female teen patients would arrive seeking testosterone per day. There were no doctors at this particular clinic. A gender counselor would ask a few questions, and an off-site mental health professional who would never actually see or speak with the patient would sign off. The clinic employee told Abigail Schreier that unlike abortion-minded women, trans-identifying kids are cash cows, and they are kept on the hook for the foreseeable future in terms of follow-up appointments, blood work, meetings, etc. No surprise here, Planned Parenthood is following the money. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back a few more minutes. This is a program note. Let me just mention that next week we will be doing interviews with Ken Starr and Tim Keller. I know we have Jerry Jenkins. He's written a book called The Chosen, which is based upon that TV program that was put together by his son. We have Michael Yosef. I think you'll want to watch all of those programs. But I thought for these last few minutes, I might do just a little bit of an overview on this issue of capitalism and socialism, because you know that it kind of has shown up in some of the conversation. Just the other day, we did interviews with our good friend Chuck Bentley in which he talked about the 7 gray swans, and one of those swans was democratic socialism. So, you know, the booklet that I have made available to you in the past on capitalism and socialism really is important, because we've recognized that the younger you are, the more likely to believe that socialism is better than capitalism. Now, the problem with that is first of all, young people under the age of 30, they probably don't even think about socialism as Soviet-styled repression. And second of all, they oftentimes don't define the terms. Capitalism, of course, is an economic system in which you have private property and the means of production are privately owned, and there's a limited role for government. In socialism, just the opposite. It's usually public or state ownership of production, and oftentimes the government is all important because of central planning. The problem we face is that most Americans generally believe that a free market is a good idea. Arthur Brooks has been on this program in which he says, well, we kind of are in a 70-30 nation. About 70% of Americans do believe in a free market economy. That's the good news. The bad news is about 30% of the control of important arenas in government, in the media, and the university, they believe in socialism. And so that's why I've put together this booklet, and you can see on the screen here, on a biblical view on capitalism and socialism. And that booklet I created in large part really to try to help people understand the difference between capitalism and socialism, and then also to address kind of the biblical issue, because some people say, well, doesn't the Bible teach socialism? You look at Acts 4, it talks about the fact that believers in Jerusalem had all things in common. It also goes on to say that the various believers put various proceeds from the various things that they sold, their land or their possessions, at the feet of the disciples. But again, I think you have to recognize that, first of all, this was a practice that was pretty much only done in Jerusalem. If you read the rest of the New Testament, you read the letters of Paul and Peter, you see that most believers in other parts of the Roman Empire had private property, and they were actually to give voluntarily to the work. Then that brings us to the second point, because this was a voluntary action that the believers in Jerusalem did. It was not mandatory, as you can see when you look at the next chapter in Acts 5, where Peter confronts Ananias. While it remained, was it not your own? After you sold it, was it not in your control? And so I think we recognize, if nothing else, that the Bible really assumes that we have private property. First of all, the 8th commandment about stealing, the 10th commandment about coveting certainly addresses that. So that book has been available for some time, and it's still available to you. But the second book that I have written is on socialism, because it occurred to me after a while that what we really need to do is not only defend some of the criticism that people have about the free market, but more importantly, address some of the claims that are being made for socialism. And of course, one of those is that, well, we're not talking about these failed socialist experiments. I have a long list of countries in Eastern Europe and in Asia and in South America and Africa, by our total 25 different failed socialist experiments. But, well, no, we're talking about other countries like Nordic countries. And then I take on some of the material that has been put together by Anders Hagstrom and by John Stossel to point out that, no, even the people in those countries are pointing out that, no, we're not socialists. Matter of fact, when we were somewhat socialist, we nearly bankrupted the society. And so then I go into some of the arguments being used to promote socialism, like socialism and equality. And it does seem a little unfair that you can think of LeBron James making $37 million a year when you have a social worker that maybe starts out at $30,000 a year. Or probably the most striking one is Jeff Bezos makes more than $320 million a day when the average salary for Amazon is around $35,000. But that's what, unfortunately, and I think even fortunately, we get when you allow freedom, when people with different skills, different abilities, different motivations are there, and the attempt to try to equalize everything doesn't work very well. So we address those issues of equality, we address some of those issues of tolerance, and many more, because if nothing else, we really want people to understand the idea of what can and should be communicated in terms of our biblical view. So anyway, these are some very helpful booklets that we have made available, one dealing with capitalism and socialism, and the more recent one on socialism. But I thought, since I have been sharing this with so many of our listeners as I was out traveling next week, we have also mentioned, and we did mention it yesterday with our conversation that we had with George Barna, the fact that as you look at some of the post-election surveys that he's been able to do through the Cultural Research Center, he's concluded that actually support for socialism is declining significantly. As a matter of fact, the most precipitous decline in socialism was for Americans ages 30 to 49. That was a group that about a decade ago we were talking about, those who were more likely to believe in socialism than capitalism, but that's dropped significantly. But even for those age 50 and older, what I thought was so striking is there has been an 8 percentage point drop for them as well. They've always been the group traditionally most supportive of free markets. So in some respects, we're seeing some really significant changes taking place. And lest you wonder what group is probably the least likely to believe in socialism, well, that would be a group of those identified either as those who have a biblical worldview, according to the Barna criteria, or what George Barna calls sage cons. Those would be spiritually active, governance-engaged conservative Christians. A very small percentage of them support socialism, but nevertheless, one of the reasons I put in both of these booklets a little bit of Does the Bible Teach Socialism? It's because there's still just a few people that still hold to that idea as well. So these are some topics that we will continue to address here on Point of View. And if nothing else, let me encourage you to get some of these booklets because they are available to you. And as we are winding down the program today, I might just mention that if you would ever want to support this ministry, you can click on that button that says Donate Now, and it reminds you that if you make a donation, especially as we get closer to our Truth Team time, you will actually receive automatically those booklets for a gift of a certain amount. And so I hope that you'll think about what you might do to support this ministry, because it helps us, but at the same time, we want to send these kinds of booklets to you every month to educate you and to give you resources you can pass on to others. One last time, though, if you have not taken the time to contact your 2 United States senators. We'll probably get on to a new issue on Monday. We have the Take Action item up there. It's in the middle column of the commentary right now. It's For the People Act moves to the Senate. And if you have not contacted your 2 senators, we encourage you to do that. My Viewpoints commentary is there, and Benedictor's commentary is there as well. And if you click on that, there is a button that says Never Miss a Viewpoint. Sign up today. And if you do so, you'll receive my commentary in your inbox Monday through Friday. You'll receive Benedictor's commentary, which you may have heard today, on Saturday. So those are all resources we're making available at Point of View. Hope you have a great weekend. I want to thank Doug and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, actually on Monday, right here on Point of View.
Conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.